We'll now look a little bit more closely at the United States and how we were involved in the war. Now, first of all, even before we entered the war, the United States would give a large amount of supplies in a program called Lend-Lease to Great Britain, and later we would expand this to include the Soviet Union and other countries at war with the Axis powers. Right? And we're doing this, especially with Great Britain, even before we're actually at war. Right? So it was clear, even though we claimed to be a neutral country, that we supported Britain against the Germans. And we were sending large numbers of supplies there. And once we were at war, the Nazis made a special effort to try and destroy American cargo ships. So that actually in terms of percentage losses, among the American branches of service, the branch of service with the highest losses by percentage was not like the Marines, as you might expect, or the Army, but actually the U.S. Merchant Marine. And if you've never heard of the Merchant Marine, those are the people in charge of supplies. They were the ones that were sending supplies to the Soviet Union and to Great Britain. And a lot of them died once we went to war. So one thing that we have to emphasize is that the United States, just like in World War I, in World War II, is using its vast industrial capacity to support our allies, right? Through this Lend-Lease program and through these supply convoys that we're sending. Now, we are going to be focusing for now on the war against Germany and the American involvement in that war. We'll talk more about the war with Japan later, but what we want to understand in terms of events, Japan will attack the United States at Pearl Harbor, why I'll talk about later, and then Nazi Germany will then declare war on the United States because his ally has just attacked the United States, and that means that we're now at war with Nazi Germany. So we will go to war now with Nazi Germany. But before we talk about that war, we need to talk a little bit about the American Homefront. And this is going to that issue I talked about earlier, that even though, and I want to emphasize, like I said, Nazi Germany and as we'll see, Imperial Japan were really terrible. I think they need to absolutely be defeated. That doesn't mean, though, that everything that we did was perfect. So here is another Dr. Seuss comic in reference to following the Pearl Harbor attack. And it says, waiting for the signal from home. And you can see lots of identical people, right? Some are tall, some are short, but they're all, and some are wearing different kinds of clothing. But you can say they all generally look the same. They are all meant to represent Japanese people. And there's this idea that Japanese people are all the same, whether they are Japanese in Japan or Japanese Americans. And it says their honorable fifth column. And a fifth column is a kind of slang that means people who are on the home front who are traitors, people who are working within a country to bring the country down. And you can see that the one Japanese man is handing out TNT explosives. The clear statement of this comic is that there are people of Japanese descent in the United States who are a threat to the United States. And so, we need to do something about them. And the solution to this Japanese problem was internment camps. Right? There's this idea that Japanese people, whether they were born in the United States or were born in Japan and immigrated, they are all a threat because all Japanese people are essentially the same. So the ones who are at war with us are the same as the ones who are in the United States, even if they're American citizens who were born here. So they are a problem because of their ethnicity. So we need to isolate them in these internment camps so they can't do anything. Now, first of all, one thing I have to emphasize is that this in many ways was very similar to what we've seen before. This is somewhat similar to what we saw before in terms of logic with the Turkish nationalism and the Armenians. This is, of course, somewhat similar to, in a sense, what Nazis were doing. It's just we didn't kill the people. We did, however, imprison people who had committed no crime, people who even were citizens, were not their rights were not respected. They were just simply, because, if you're a citizen, you're supposed to get due process of law before you're imprisoned. Doesn't matter. They're Japanese. Throw them in the internment camp. So even though we weren't purposely killing people, the idea though is that we're following this logic that these people, because they are ethnically different, they and are part of the enemy ethnicity, we can't trust them, put them in camps to deal with that problem. And I should point out that a lot of them were forced before they entered the camps to sell their homes, to sell their farms, to sell their businesses at very low prices, because people knew that that they weren't going to be around. They couldn't take care of them. This was clearly going to be a long war. So, they could force them to sell at very low prices. And one thing I also have to stress is that there is not a single instance of any Japanese person living in the United States, citizen or not, actually aiding or helping the Japanese government in any way. It simply did not happen. So this image that Dr. Seuss created of this honorable fifth column of all these people, Japanese people, going to commit sabotage, going to spy, it didn't happen. There are zero, none, nada, no instances of Japanese in the United States doing that. I want to note just really quickly that one person who experienced this was a man named George Takei, who played Sulu in the original Star Trek. And he talks about how his family had been taken out, I believe it was a family of 4. He was a small child at the time, had been taken out of a comfortable 2-bedroom home and forced to live in a horse stall. So, a stall where a horse lived. So there was one horse that was moved, and they got to live where the horse lived, whereas previously they lived in a nice house together. And sometimes when they returned, this is what they came home to. No Japs wanted, so after the war, welcome home. We're making it clear we don't want you around. Now, I do want to stress there are Americans who were disturbed by this, who thought this was wrong. One man who would criticize this in this time period was a man named Bill Mauldin. Mauldin is famous for the Willie and Joe comics. Bill Mauldin was stationed in the U.S. military as a sort of journalist in the Western theater. He was in Germany and in France, and so his comics concentrated on life there. And he followed he basically created these two kind of typical American what they would call dog-face infantrymen, Willie and Joe. And it was basically a kind of soldier's perspective comic. So I love this. You've got the American soldiers ready to ambush and take prisoner this German soldier who's carrying a bottle of alcohol. And Willie says to Joe, "Don't startle him, Joe. It's almost full." Meaning we don't want him to be scared and drop the alcohol, because we totally want to take this guy prisoner so we can get the booze from him. Right. So that's the kind of humor that Bill Mauldin used. Very much was in touch with the average everyday life of your typical American soldier. And Bill Mauldin was very critical of the American actions in its unjust treatment of these Japanese people, Japanese ethnic people. Of course, a lot of them were Japanese Americans, were people who were born in the United States, and so therefore had citizenship. And you can see this here, where they're at this is a Japanese American soldier who's been highly decorated, as you can see, and he's trying to go to a victory bar, which presents itself as very patriotic. Do your duty, we do buy bonds, America for Americans. And then it says no Japs allowed. And you have this bartender who pretends to be patriotic, refusing to recognize the fact that even though, despite being treated so badly, many Japanese Americans would still volunteer to fight for the United States, though they were not sent to fight against the Japanese. They were sent to fight against the Germans. I think in part because there was this idea maybe we can't trust them, but also because, of course, I don't know what would have happened to them if they would have been captured by the Japanese army. But on the right is a particularly sad and poignant but perceptive understanding of the injustice done to them. It says, you can see where it says America for the Americans, fruit and vegetables under new management. You can see where the Japanese name Hitoshi Mitsuki has been crossed out. And below, the man who's now taken over that store is talking to a customer, and it says, "Nah, we don't have to worry about the owner coming back. He was killed in Italy," meaning that and so the Bill Mauldin has honed in on this injustice, that this Japanese American who's been treated badly and whose family has likely been treated badly by the Japanese government, nevertheless went to fight for the United States in its war effort and was killed in Italy. And his reward is that someone took over his store. And of course, this kind of discrimination was not just aimed at people of Japanese descent. The African Americans were also a part of this in a sense. African Americans, of course, were not interred, but they did fight in the war. They were volunteers and also conscripts. They were also drafted, but it was into a segregated army, right? So you had your military police that would have been white, and then you also had your military police colored, meaning people of African descent, African Americans. So there was this was a segregated army, right? The American army was segregated in World War II, right? There were white units and black units. And so it's important to remember, and sometimes we look back as Americans to World War II and think, oh yeah, we had to beat the Nazis because they were totally racist. And our country, as you can see, had serious issues with racism as well. And that's important to remember. Like I said earlier, it's important to kind of recognize the sacrifice of veterans, to recognize that it was important to defeat the Nazis in Imperial Japan, but that the fact that their regimes were so evil does not mitigate the sins that you can find in the United States. And that's something we have to understand, that the military that played such a huge role in defeating Adolf Hitler was itself a segregated military. But despite these very serious problems, it is an effective military. The United States, along with the British, some French who have, the Free French as they're called, who were able to escape from France when it was taken over by Nazi Germany, as well as troops from the African Empire of Britain and France, as well as many other groups, will work together to invade Italy, and will be able to knock Italy out of the war. The United States, and as well as the British, and I want to stress, just like with World War I, when I talk about the British, we're talking also about like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But on June 6, 1944, the Allies will invade France, and will be able then to open up another front, right? So far, the Soviet Union has been taking the brunt of the fighting against the Nazis. It did help them somewhat when Italy was invaded. But this invasion of France, the retaking of France, will relieve a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. The Nazis will be forced to pull troops away from the Soviet Union and send them west to fight against the Allies. There, the British, the French, and the Americans, and others as well. And one thing I want to point out, this really was striking to me. To give you an idea of how this is remembered in history in the Soviet Union, or I should say Russia today, I was at a conference and I was talking to some Russian Korean woman. And what I mean by that was she was a citizen of Russia, but she was ethnically Korean. She didn't speak Korean anymore. Her family had lived in Russia for a very long time and had forgotten Korean, but she spoke Russian and English. And so I don't know why exactly she said this, but I was really struck by it. We were talking about World War II, and she said, "I want to thank you for your country helping to invade France in D-Day and relieve pressure on us when we were trying to fight the Nazis." Right? So I was really struck by this, that not only did this woman know about this history, but that she felt a sense of gratitude. I don't know how widespread that was. I don't know if she was trying to build a good relationship, but I was really struck by the fact that she was thankful. And it's interesting, that kind of historical memory. Now, one thing I should also point out is I always remember my parents' wedding anniversary because they were married on June 6, 1944. And that's how I remember it, is that they were married on D-Day. And I think that says hopefully it means I'm a good historian, but sadly it also means I'm a bad son, right? If I was a good son, I would remember D-Day because that's when my parents were married. But instead, I remember when my parents were married because that was D-Day. But that being said, the Americans, British, and other allies will push east, the Russians will push west, and together we will crush the Nazis. And Hitler will commit suicide in a bunker, and Germany will officially surrender on May 8th. Now, I think normally, of course, when you end a war, when you win a war, you feel a sense of relief that you survived and satisfaction that you have achieved victory. And of course, that in this war, especially, that a great evil has been destroyed. However, I think that celebration was, in a sense, cut short, or I should perhaps say limited, by the fact that as the Soviet forces and as the moved in to Nazi Germany, as the Allied forces, also France, Britain, the United States, and so forth, moved into Germany, they started to discover the extermination camps that the Nazis had set up for Jews and other people that they wanted to get rid of. The Holocaust, which is the term we use to refer specifically to the attempt to destroy the Jews of Europe, would kill about 6 to 7 million people. That's a lot of people. Now, to give you a sense, though, I mean, I have no idea what 6 million people is, right? Like, I can't understand a number that big. But let me give you a number that even I can understand. Hopefully, if you're like me and you don't get the 6 to 7 million, that you will understand. There were only about 9 million Jews in Europe. So if 6 or 7 million Jews die in the Holocaust, and there were only 9 million Jews in Europe, that's like 2 out of every 3 Jews died. Now, I can get that. Can you imagine that, right? If you have a group of people, and all of a sudden, 2 out of every 3 of them are dead. And I think one warning that comes out of the Holocaust, in a sense, is the discovery of the gas chambers, right? So remember how I talked about earlier how there were these groups of people called Einsatzgruppen, whose job it was to round up Jews and others that the Nazis wanted to get rid of and shoot them, and how the problem was, like, those guys had to get really drunk to do it, and some of them went crazy. And you have to think, I mean, that would be disturbing to shoot men, women, and children. You're at such close range that, I mean, I don't want to be gross, but of course when you shoot them, you get their blood and brains and bone and organs and everything. Human tissue will be covering you after you shoot them, right? So one thing that the German government did, instead of saying, oh, maybe we should stop doing this because it's clearly wrong, which is why our troops have to get drunk to do it and because they're going crazy, instead they try to figure out a way to make it more efficient and less disturbing. And that's what the gas chambers were. What would happen is Jews would be rounded up and taken to a camp, and they would be told, after traveling sometimes for days in crowded railway cars, that they were going to be given a shower. And they would happily go into the shower room because, hey, you haven't taken a shower for several days. Wouldn't it be nice to be clean? And the doors would be closed, and instead of water being pumped into the shower, poison gas would be pumped in. And so instead of shooting someone, all the German soldiers had to do was, just tell these people, go in and take a shower, and then close the doors, push a few buttons. Maybe you heard a few screams, but it was hard to because the concrete and the steel doors were very thick. And then once the screams die down, you open the doors and everyone is dead. That is not nearly as disturbing as shooting people. When you shoot someone, you're like, yeah, I shot that person. Here, all I did was push a few buttons, and I opened the door, and people are dead. I mean, obviously, I'm still the one who killed them, but I feel a distance because all I did was push a few buttons, and they didn't, complain. They went into the shower happily. And so we human beings, it seems, when there's something evil that we want to do, instead of listening to our conscience, we try and create distance and hide from it. And we use euphemisms like the final solution, or let's, send them to the showers in order to hide from the evil that we do. So I think one lesson from the Nazis, of course, is when we find ourselves hiding from reality, when we want to do something, we want to do something, we try and, but we have a sense that it's wrong. Instead of hiding from that reality, we should really face it and say, well, if this is wrong, we're just not going to do it. We're going to figure out another way.